and welcome to Factually. I'm Adam Conover. Thank you so much for joining me on the show again. The Democratic National Convention happened a few weeks back, and you know what? Incredibly, the Democrats were not in disarray. In fact, they were in array. Why? How? Well, the Democratic Party actually responded to the will of its members and swapped out a dusty old candidate for a candidate who people actually like, or who at the very least can deliver a speech. And you know, this seems pretty basic, but the results have not been just positive, but according to official Democrat branding, joyful. And for those on the left of American politics, this has turned out to be a particularly interesting moment. You know, a couple months back, we had Bhaskar Sankara on the show to talk about why the left hadn't won meaningful victories in America in decades, if not centuries. But if you look at the DNC from a certain angle, it kind of seems like the left might be on the march. I mean, you had the Midwestern populism of Tim Walz, Harris's focus on the middle class, and the acknowledgement of AOC as a major mainstream star in the party. There is some reason to believe that maybe the party has metabolized some of the lessons of Bernie Sanders into a broader consensus. But at the same time, there was very little mention of climate change, let alone single-payer health care. Harris also seemed to do a fair amount of military saber rattling. And although she did mention the plight of the Palestinians in Gaza and the need for the Palestinian people to have self-determination, the DNC couldn't muster the strength or the guts to let an actual Palestinian speak on stage, even though there was a Palestinian lawmaker waiting in the wings to do so. So, how should we think about the power of the left when it comes to this election? Is that power waxing or waning, and what is the prospect for the future? Well, to talk about that on the show this week, we have an absolutely incredible guest. But before we get into it, I just want to remind you that if you want to support this show and all of the amazing conversations we bring you, you can do so on Patreon. Head to patreon.com/Adam Conover. $5 a month gets you every one of our episodes ad-free. We even have an online community you can join. We would love to have you there. And if you like stand-up comedy, or even if you don't, please come see me on the road this year. This year, I'm headed to Baltimore, Portland, Oregon, Seattle, Denver, Austin, Batavia, Illinois, Chicago, Illinois, San Francisco, Toronto, Chicago, Boston, Providence, Rhode Island. I'm headed all over the damn country. Come see me. I got a brand new hour of stand-up comedy I'd love to share with you. Head to adamconover.net for all those tickets and tour dates. And now let's get to this week's episode. Osita Nwanevu is one of the smartest political writers on the left today. He's a columnist for The Guardian, a contributing editor for The New Republic, and his work has appeared in many other outlets as well. I know you're going to love this conversation. Please welcome Osita Nwanevu. Osita, thank you so much for being on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So you wrote a piece in the last month or so called The Left Are the Adults in the Room regarding American politics. In the time since we've watched the DNC occur, which had me really wondering what is the status of the left vis-a-vis democratic politics. Are they waxing or are they waning? What is your view, having watched the convention?
Yeah, I mean, I think that assessment still stands. So I wrote that piece. It's funny. I started working on that piece before Biden dropped out, and sort of had to do these edits to it and then changes to it as we sort of saw the chaos of that month play out. But I think one of the really animating forces behind it was this idea that, look, people knew for years that Biden was this old guy, that he'd kind of lost a step politically. It seemed like the people who were willing to talk about the most frankly were people on the left who've been kind of joking about this since 2020, but it became obviously a live political issue. And we saw over the course of that month, a month that I won't forget, a lot of people in the Democratic Party have this kind of grand conniption about what to do about it as a problem that they should have seen coming. And it seemed like we were just sort of unable to cope for the entire that month of this sort of basic political situation. And there was a lot of denial happening and a lot of, hand-wringing. And it seemed to me to be indicative in a small but important way, of the kind of general inertia that we see in democratic politics all the time, where people are very resistant to change. People are very resistant to taking even well-justified risks. And so the piece came kind of out of that feeling that Biden's situation was indicative of broader tendencies within the Democratic Party that have even policy implications that I go on to talk about a little bit. So, having seen that convention and having seen the events the last couple of weeks and the explosion of interest or explosion of enthusiasm about Kamala Harris, I still kind of feel that way. I think it's good that Harris is doing so much better. It's not the race is not over, but she is doing better than Biden. It seems like the Democrats are going to go into November with more energy and more confidence than they would have before. But even the kind of zig and zag from Biden to Harris and the kind of explosion of enthusiasm there is, I think, indicative of the fact that I think the Democratic Party takes cues from leadership. It is not really possessed of a clear ideological vision or clear direction. And that kind of enables the swing we've seen towards Harris. It's not like replacing Biden with Harris was indicative of some kind of grand ideological shift or a grand change of program. It's all these people who were insisting for weeks and weeks and weeks that we couldn't replace Biden and all the logistical challenges to and so on. Once it became clear that Biden was going, that Nancy Pelosi and people in the Democratic Party in the background kind of urged him off the scene, everything kind of snapped into place for Harris. Okay, she's the person. We're all for her. She is, she's the standard bearer now. I don't know. I feel like there's something to me that's still suspect about that switch, even though I thought it should happen. The way that people who had been adamantly defending Biden's price on the ticket switched over within the space of 24 hours into saying, well, Kamala Harris was always, she was always the one. There's something about that I think is reflective of a kind of unseriousness. I mean, I will always remember, for as long as I live, the way that people talked about the decision for Biden to go. I was very tentatively saying, over the course of that month, well, I wasn't really all that convinced over the course of Biden's term that, Biden wasn't doing so well in the polls. But if you look at the other polls, and not like Kamala Harris or Gavin Newsom, whoever was going to do all that better, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The debate really was the thing that changed my mind. But even after the debate, I was kind of like, well, it seems like Biden's going to have a harder time convincing people he's up to the challenge now, having had that debate in the public mind. So it's probably worth, taking the risk of replacing him on the ticket now, especially because I think there's probably some upside, even though it's not evident in the polls right now for Harris specifically. The way that people reacted to that suggestion, I will always you had people saying, well, it's actually because Ezra Klein and the Pod Save Bros are the ones pushing this along. The idea of replacing Biden on the ticket is actually racist. It's this conspiracy fomented by rich white guys who don't know, I don't know if people are listening to this, they can't tell. I'm not a rich white guy, actually, myself. I don't think you could have dismissed that suggestion on this ground. But the way people were talking about this was crazy. This idea that, we can't replace Biden because the ballots are going to have to be changed. And Republicans are going to, institute all of these lawsuits to prevent that from happening. Well, there were no ballots because there were no official nominees in the first place.
Yeah, because the nomination
over again.
The nomination happens at the convention. That's what the convention is for.
Exactly. I mean, in this particular case, they did the virtual kind of nomination beforehand. But the point was, like, at that point, when people were contemplating the switch, there was no official nominee. So to say that Republicans were going to, mess up the ballots if you changed was ridiculous. People said this over and over again. As soon as Harris was the one, it kind of evaporated. Where were these challenges that we were assured were going to happen?
Yeah.
So there was just a level of unseriousness, and I don't want to harp on this specific issue for too long because I talked about other stuff in that piece. But I've been thinking for years about the extent to which we have a kind of fandom-based politics now. Right, this weird phenomenon where people are very, very engaged with politics. They go out and vote in every election. They can tell you, who's running in the Democratic primary for the Senate in Kentucky, even though they live in New York City. There's this level of deep engagement with politics, but it's not really rooted in, certainly not policy. It's not really rooted in the substance of what we elect people for.
Right.
People are very, very, committed Democrats, are very, very committed Republicans. That's, one of the sources of our polarization. But that commitment to these parties and the people who lead them hasn't necessarily translated into a deep investment in the actual substance of politics.
It's politics as sports.
Exactly.
I'm rooting for the team or the person. Oh my God, this is a great new player on the scene. I like them, but it's not connected to like the material reality of that people live in, that these politicians might change, that or let alone movement politics or anything along those lines.
To the point where people have foam fingers. If you saw the convention, these very creative, like Michigan-shaped things. One of the things I thought was so funny about the convention too, specifically, was that in that month before Biden actually dropped out, people were debating what should happen. There's this idea of doing an open convention that people are for, not just going to Harris like I supported myself and I pushed for, but let's throw it to the convention, have it in the way that they used to do it in the olden days, where the delegates on the floor will be the people who will have these debates and whatever. And just sort of looking at the convention itself and seeing these people dressed as like Bootsy Collins and waving the foam fingers around, like the idea that these people would have been the people to like fight over who the nominee is going to be was crazy to me. I mean, in logistical terms, yes, they are delegates in the same way that the people who were at conventions in the olden days were delegates, but clearly like these are not people who are there and who would have been prepared to do the kind of wheeling and dealing that would have been necessary to choose a different nominee on the floor.
It's like Democratic volunteer number one from Michigan, the person who knocked the most doors or runs the party, local party in Detroit or whatever it is.
Right.
That the biggest, what it was Comic-Con for Democrats, right?
Exactly.
It's like the biggest fan of the party gets to go.
Right.
The idea that these people would be engaged in some kind of deliberative process, let alone the idea that the Democratic Party as an institution could run such a thing after not having done so for 50, 60 years, that they could take a convention which for decades has been a coronation and a party and turn it into some kind of like deliberative procedure is ludicrous. And I love Ezra Klein. I was shocked that he thought that could happen. I was like, look, either we're going to Kamala or it's Biden. Like there's no open convention. It seemed like not connected to what such a thing would actually entail.
Right. I mean, I think at the end of that process, even if you had it, I think that Harris would have won, but she would have won, I think, a more battered candidate than she is now. And we would not have had the vibes we've had now if that had happened. I just feel like the party's politics, and this is, again, not just a Democratic thing, are kind of dominated by people who are invested in the Democratic Party as a kind of institution abstracted from what the Democratic Party does, which I think is both deeply annoying as somebody on the left, but also as an opportunity. Because what that means functionally, and I think this is a source of some of the progress we did see under Biden, what that means functionally is that the party is this kind of open container for whatever ideas happen to wield their way into elite office spaces, basically in Washington, D.C., right? So Biden, I think, comes in 2020 without a real deep set of ideological convictions, to the extent that he'd had them. I think that towards the end of that primary, you saw, because it was him or Bernie, and they wanted to reconcile the party, to the extent that he had these older ideological convictions, he was actually pretty willing to move left on certain policy grounds, certainly further left than he was when he started the race. And I think it's partially because, when it comes to whether it's corporate power or climate change or all of the kind of economic policies that have been at the center of Democratic thought for the last 10, 15 years, the people who've kind of prevailed in a lot of the policy discussions in Washington, D.C. are people who are in the progressive camp. Frank Foer writes about this pretty well in his book, The Last Politician. There was this period after the 2016 election where Democrats were sort of asking themselves what happened politically, but also, how could they speak to what they saw as a kind of populist fervor in the electorate. The first inklings of it we saw, with Occupy Wall Street. Donald Trump reflects a different kind of flavor of it. But the people are sort of very newly attuned to inequality as an issue, newly attuned to corporate power as an issue. And so there was this real soul-searching moment in Democratic policy circles where they sort of thought to themselves, well, maybe progressives are right about this or that. And they started searching around, grasping around for ideas. Jake Sullivan was one of the people who was deeply involved in those conversations. He's now one of the central figures behind the scenes of the Biden administration. But people who I think very influenced by Elizabeth Warren in particular start kind of finding their way into institutions that end up shaping the Biden administration and shaping its thinking on a lot of different issues. And because Biden, I think, is at that point this empty vessel who just wanted to be the president, he's kind of receptive to a lot of those new ideas. And I think that's where Bidenomics as an economic program comes from. So I say all of that to... Yeah, go ahead.
I was somewhat shocked when he got into office. Again, he was sort of an empty vessel. He seemed like the most moderate, acceptable choice. And then he gets in there saying, I'm the second coming of FDR.
Right.
I'm going to put money in your pocket. I'm going to break up the monopolies. And if you look at the shift on antitrust, it was one of the biggest policy shifts of the last couple of years. I never would have expected that to come out of Biden. It was stunning how many ideas it seemed like he took from the progressive left.
Exactly. And I'd be remiss to leave out the other thing too, which is COVID. So COVID comes along towards the end of the Democratic primary 2020, completely upends the economy. Democrats in policy have these, memories of the Obama's response to the recession and the stimulus, which I think consensus had congealed at that point that it had been too small and they hadn't done enough to aggressively try to juice up demand again. So COVID comes along, devastates the economy. I think there's a determination amongst Biden's team and amongst Democrats in general that they're going to make the same mistake again, that they needed to go big with the economic response to that as well. So that and the fact that he was, trying to reconcile the two wings of the party at the end of the primary, I think pull him in a leftward direction that ends up shaping the administration when he gets in there, which is why you see, as you point out, the antitrust stuff is a great example. Lena Khan at the FTC, championed by people in the Warren, wing of the progressive part of the Democratic Party. So I say all of that to say, the extent to which the Democratic Party is glommed onto by its supporters as an institution, abstracted from ideas, means that if you have the, avenues to get into democratic policy discourse and kind of import your ideas there, the Democratic base is going to go for whatever. they're just happy to vote for Democrats, whether it's, if Kamala Harris came out tomorrow and said, well, I support Medicare for all, I don't think you'd see any kind of real movement amongst Democrats, at least, away from her towards running. I think they're just happy to have somebody out on the top of the ticket who is a Democrat and seems like they're going to, stick it to Donald Trump. It's both annoying and an opportunity. I think that means that, if the left managed to succeed in finding ways to get its ideas onto the Democratic agenda, the rest of the party will kind of follow. And it's just exactly the same thing, I think, by the way, is happening on the Republican side.
In what way? Who's getting whose ideas onto the Republican platform?
Well, I think that Donald Trump has been read as a kind of ideological wrecking ball, basically. He's this guy who came in, nobody expected in 2016, and completely shredded, all these years of Republican orthodoxy. Now he's talking about he wants to do tariffs. Now he's talking about how bad NAFTA was, and he's more willing to think about government intervention in healthcare and this kind of thing. I really kind of believe that Donald Trump's successes are not based upon that novel approach to Republican rhetoric. I think people on the Republican side like his personality. They like the way that he talks about immigration and people in the country that they dislike. And whatever agenda he and the people who are supporting him in the Republican Party, put in underneath all of that, I think that you'll see Republicans and the Republican base kind of willing to support. I think the immigration is the kind of one thing that you can't shift on. Donald Trump said tomorrow, actually, I've changed my mind and I support more expansive immigration policy, more open immigration policy. Yeah, then he would, I think, lose a lot of his luster. When it comes to things like tax policy, regulations, these kinds of things, I don't think Republican voters are paying all that much attention to what Donald Trump says about these things. So
It's a cultural affinity, not a policy-based
It's a cultural affinity. And I think it's relevant too that, everybody should remember, I don't know if people do remember, should remember the Tea Party, right? In the early years of the Obama administration, 2009, 2010, the first stirrings of right-wing populism of this kind, crazy conspiracy theories, people threatening violence, so on, things that feel very similar and actually as like forerunners to Trumpism as a political style, right? The actual substantive content of the Tea Party was very different. It was kind of like extreme laissez-faire economics. We care a lot about the deficit. We care a lot about government spending. We want to return to kind of classical liberal or libertarian politics. That one of the people that a lot of people, these folks glom onto was Ron Paul, this kind of libertarian, right? The actual substantive politics of the Tea Party were very different from what's been designated as Trumpism. But you saw the same kind of figures and the same kind of political style there that we have with Donald Trump, because it's not fundamentally about policy. It's about anger. It's about it's about registering your disapproval of people in the country you don't like. So in the very same way, I think the Republican Party, it's a fandom seems like too, you're talking about something getting very dangerous on the right. So fandom seems a little bit weird to me, but in the same way, you do have people who are glomming onto people and institutions more so than they're glomming onto actual policy ideas, actual policy substance, in a way that, I think on the Democratic side presents an opportunity for the left. Somebody who covers politics and somebody who cares about policy is often very annoying to try to deal with.
And do you think the left is starting to see that opportunity strategically? I mean, just again, to the title of your piece, The Left Are the Adults in the Room, I did notice that the first people I knew to start going, I'm coconut pilled on X or on TikTok or whatever, were the leftists, right? And it was interesting because I was like, well, they don't think that Kamala Harris is particularly a leftist, apart from, maybe she's slightly more pro-Palestinian than, Biden is to some extent. She wants a ceasefire, blah, 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 blah. A matter of degree. It wasn't that. It wasn't that they saw her as like a Bernie or an AOC figure. It was just the left was the group going, wait, no, we do need to win and defeat Donald Trump. And the way to do it is to get coconut pilled. And we're having that sort of strange energy. It was fun. It was shit posting, but it was also strategic. And it turned out to be the right strategic play. And that was really interesting because the left is often accused of being fundamentally unstrategic, of being a protest, movement rather than one that actually wants to build power. And there's plenty of times I felt the left is absolutely guilty of that. In my own interactions with the movement. So I'm curious, is this a new birth of strategic thinking on the left?
I think you can see evidence of that in some corners. I think that the way that people talked about Kamala Harris, like half ironically, half seriously, as I kind of did myself, might be evidence of that. I think that most people who consider themselves on the left at this point are just tired of losing. And sort of need a sense of direction. I think it manifests itself in all kinds of ways. One of them is, I think, a reconciliation to the reality that we live in a country where there are two major parties. And if you want to achieve power, you can use all available levers that exist to achieve power. That means engaging with the one of those parties that is nearer to your ideology than the other one. That's just a practical reality. And I think that more and more people on the left, I think, are willing to accept that, which is not to say that they are willing to abandon critiques of the Democratic Party or that they're going to give Kamala Harris an easy time. And I think that Gaza is, one area where that's very clear. Even people who were coconut pilled and saying, we think that Biden should go and Harris would be the right choice, are still criticizing her on Gaza, are still pointing out, the fact that there hasn't really been very much significant movement from the Biden administration since she's trying to take it on that issue. But that's a complexity of politics, right? Understanding the political situation realistically, for me at least, means saying, look, we have a Democratic Party in this country that has, under Biden, I think, moved significantly left on certain issues, is not a left-wing party, but I think presents certain opportunities. It's important, given that they win this next election, and that Donald Trump does not win this next election, and Kamala Harris seemed like she would be a better candidate for the party on those grounds than Joe Biden would have been. At the same time, we should continue to push her on Gaza and all of these other issues that we care about, because absent that pressure, she's going to sort of migrate to the center. And I think that that's all coherent and a sensible way of thinking about politics.
Yeah.
And I think more people on the left think that than not, which is not to say that that's a universal tendency or universal way of thinking. I think that you still see people on the left who are hostile enough to the Democratic Party that they point to or insist that there are some other avenues to achieving power in this country, whether it's, talking about organizing kind of amorphously and thinking that there's some kind of mass uprising is in the works if we just sort of post enough. I don't know what the alternative. I'll be honest with you, I don't know. You'll have to have one of those people on the show to ask them what they think. I don't say that, to be an asshole. I myself am at a point where I kind of think that if you're realistic about politics, and you care about, materialism, this word that people on the left use all the time, you care about material conditions that shape our lives and shape our society, that means being attuned to concrete realities and not throwing yourself into utopian visions or a kind of wish casting about the way things could be, should be, in a different reality. We live in the country we live in. We have the political situation we have, and I think that means, finding the gears and levers that exist and trying to figure out how to use them to our ends. And that means sometimes trying to assess the political strengths and weaknesses of people that we don't like objectively. And that's what I've tried to do with Kamala Harris.
And seeing how you can use them to your ends, not letting the perfect be the enemy, the good. I mean, it can be very comforting sometimes to fight for a future utopia that will exist after you're dead, but it might not be affecting material reality as much as swallowing your pride and doing some work for a candidate who's not perfect, but might affect the reality on the ground more directly. Hey, Factually listeners, I got a quick favor to ask you. We are conducting an audience survey, and we want to hear from you. See, we know you love the show, but we want to make sure that this is a show you continue to love and that we keep making it better, more listenable, more engaging to you, that the ad experience isn't too annoying, all that good stuff. In order to do that, we need to know a little bit more about you, our audience, what makes you tick, what you like about the show, what you don't like, stuff like that. The survey is a quick, easy, and free way to support the show. It'll take you 2 minutes, and you'll be helping us out so much by doing it. So if that interests you, it doesn't have to, but if you'd like to help us out, go to gum.fm/factually to fill out our audience survey. That's gum.fm/factually. Folks, today's episode is brought to you by Alma. Finding someone who truly understands what I'm going through has been a tremendous help during some of my toughest times. So if you're thinking about getting some licensed expert help to navigate your own challenges, I highly recommend giving Alma a try. The thing about therapy is it's really most effective when you feel genuinely heard and understood. That is why Alma doesn't just help you find a therapist, they help you find the right therapist. You can easily browse their directory and filter based on what you want to focus on, like anxiety, relationships, or major life transitions. You can also choose based on preferences like gender, sexuality, faith, and more. And another great thing, Alma can help you find a therapist who accepts your insurance. Over 95% of therapists at Alma take insurance, including Aetna, Cigna, United Healthcare, and others. People who find in-network care through Alma save an average of 77% on the cost of therapy. Getting started is effortless. You can browse the directory without needing to create an account or share any payment information. And plus, you can book a free 15-minute consultation call with any therapist you're interested in. It is a perfect way to see if they're the right fit for you, so you can find someone you really click with. So visit helloalma.com/factually to get started and schedule a free consultation today. That's helloalma.com/factually. Folks, I am so excited to tell you about this week's sponsor, Delete Me. It's a service I've been using for ages, and it really works. How much of your personal info do you think is floating around online? Maybe you've got a public social media profile or an email out there, but that's it, right? Wrong. There's actually a mountain of personal data being bought, sold, and traded by data brokers. Things you never meant to be public, like your home address, phone number, and even the names of your relatives. anyone with an internet connection and some bad intent can dig up everything they need to make your life miserable. And in recent years, we've seen an uptick in online harassment, identity theft, and even real-life stalking, all because of this easily accessible information. You know, when I became a target of harassment from people who found my details online, I signed up for Delete Me, and honestly, it is one of the best choices I've ever made. Their team of experts works tirelessly to hunt down your information, remove it, and keep it gone. You, your family, and your loved ones deserve to feel safe from this kind of invasion of privacy. So check out Delete Me, not just for your security, but for your friends and family too. You can get 20% off your Delete Me plan when you go to joindeleteme.com/Adam and use the promo code Adam at checkout. That's joindeleteme.com/Adam, promo code Adam. I'll say that, one example of a means of building power that is not based on electoralism is labor organizing.
100%.
That is a way to build power and to change the world without relying on someone's vote. And you also saw hints of that on stage. I mean, Sean Fain gave a rousing speech. There was a fellow from More Perfect Union who gave a terrific speech. I'm curious. I mean, I spent so much of the DNC reading the tea leaves of, how much is a left perspective working its way in, talking about the selection of Governor Tim Walz as the vice presidential running mate. I mean, first of all, I thought this guy would never be selected, specifically because all the leftists I knew were pulling for him. And I was like, that means he's too much of we can't have our cake and eat it too. So therefore, we're going to get someone else. Instead, the Democratic Party, again, appears to make the right decision, picks a true political superstar, saw raw talent when they recognized raw talent when they saw it. But then also when Walz spoke, I was like, wait, this is almost a certain form of like Midwest, like New Deal era sounding left populism in a way, where he's talking about, the inherent dignity of every single person to live a life, and, your neighbors aren't like you, but you help them out anyway. Just this very sort of down home, we all have to help each other, kind of, I don't know, way of making honestly, a social welfare state sound like fundamentally American in a way to me. I'm curious if you saw those same echoes. None of it was policy. It was all just sort of like thematic and vibes based.
Yeah. I mean, I think they're in a place where they're trying to say a lot of different things at once, but they've recognized that one of the things that you should say, or one of the kind of rhetorical modes you should be in as a Democratic candidate, is a kind of progressive populist mode. Whether you frame it as kind of Americana or not is a different question. But I think that, we're seeing in the Walz pick, and I think some of the other language that Harris has used, a recognition that progressive politics can play. That I think that, the enthusiasm that people had for Walz was built on successes of his administration in Minnesota. I think that people have been talking for years about how they've gotten so many different progressive initiatives passed in the state, and it wasn't as much as people tried to frame him as a kind of Bernie Sanders in disguise on the right. He was not, for the beginning of his career, a kind of reliably progressive guy. He was actually kind of down the middle, but local conditions in Minnesota prevailed for the left in ways that allowed him to pass the agenda that he was able to. And Harris' team, I think, rightfully saw that as an asset. They saw him as somebody who could speak the language of progressivism in a way that seemed folksy, and that's I think been an asset for them. But at the same time, I think the other rhetorical mode you saw at the convention and you've seen since is a kind of tack to the center on certain issues, whether that's immigration or criminal justice policy. They're trying to do both things at once. Yeah. In a way that I think is kind of similar to the way that Biden ended up trying to do both things at once as the election drew closer. He, I think, retreated from some of the progressivism of his earlier in his term. I think that's just the reality of what you have to do in general election. But I think that it's important that people who are running in Democratic politics now understand that there is a progressive constituency that they have to speak to, number one, in order to even win a primary. But number two, I think that they've come to understand, as Bernie Sanders has gone on and on about since he ran in 2016, a lot of these ideas are popular. The idea that people shouldn't be bankrupted because they had a medical procedure. That's a pretty good idea. The idea that the rich have been undertaxed and people like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk aren't contributing enough to the general welfare. That's a good idea. These aren't radical propositions, I think, to most Americans. I think you have a Democratic Party right now that acknowledges that and sees the potential in that kind of rhetoric. Because if they don't do that, I think that Donald Trump and the Republican Party are trying to make this play where they cast themselves as the real advocates for workers and working people in this country, people who didn't go to college. You saw Sean O'Brien give this speech at the RNC that was very divisive and got a lot of pushback from the labor movement. But I think that was reflective of an effort that Republicans are trying to make to cast themselves as a new Republican Party that's more attentive to the issues of ordinary working Americans. So if Democrats don't, do what I think the Harris campaign has done and try to adopt more progressive language, more progressive framing, I think that, the Republicans are going to try to take advantage of that absence. And we're already seeing, I don't think it's a huge amount, but it doesn't have to be because elections are so close. We're seeing erosion from the Democratic side to Republicans among non-college, non-white people. And that, in a state like Pennsylvania and a state like Michigan, that could, decide the election. So it's of necessity for, I think, Democrats to think seriously about beyond this campaign, beyond this particular election, thoroughly integrating, I think, certain progressive rhetorical, certain aspects of press rhetoric, at least. And I think, I'd also hope that they adopt policies too, substantively, that fleshes out all that they're saying about working people
the progressive economics or progressive economic populism was really on display, talking about Sean Fain, anti-monopoly stuff. Kamala Harris in her speech talking about we're going to do a middle-class tax cut. And then if you look at what she's talking about child tax credits and, lots of good progressive policy. All that stuff sounds good. At the same time, you saw a hard turn over the past couple of years towards not just the center, but the right. Let's talk about criminal justice reform and the fact that not only is, the party on the center, it's like anathema to talk about criminal justice reform. We're sitting here 4 years after the George Floyd moment, after the election of progressive prosecutors, et cetera, to the point where you've got. I remember I was listening to Ezra Klein's podcast. He's talking to Jamel Bowie, and they're talking about, it's so great that Kamala Harris can run as a prosecutor because that meets the moment. I'm like, both these guys know about the immense national sin of mass incarceration, right? And the crime that we're committing against our own citizens through over-policing and jailing people, et cetera. None of that has changed since 2020. And yet the entire political conversation has left, that issue in the dust. You can't even talk about it on stage anymore. And that's, to me, deeply sad because that's an issue I have covered huge amount in my work and really care about. And so it's gives you whiplash to watch, right? To say, okay, we've got progressive populism here on economic issues. On criminal justice, we are on the right. Climate change, barely mentioned. And then when it comes to Gaza, Kamala says, the Palestinian people have a right to self-determination. Your ears perk up. Oh, okay. Hold on a second. All right. Except that then, of course, they don't allow a Palestinian lawmaker to speak, Palestinian American lawmaker to speak. Instead, they only speak to the hostages and have the parents of the hostage speak on stage, et cetera. It's very hard to sort of get your bearings. Is there any pattern, you think, to which issues from the progressive left the Democratic Party has been picking up versus which it has been rejecting?
I think the pattern is definitely that they're picking up on kind of core economic issues and trying to reject or leave behind parts of the progressive agenda that seem socioculturally freighted. So that's immigration, that's criminal justice reform, policies that are about minorities, to just put it bluntly. I think that there's been this read of the last few years, and I really this read of how Trump got into office that centers his racism, that centers the way that he used cultural antagonism or cultural anxiety, as people say euphemistically, to activate this white working class constituency that turned the Rust Belt over to him in 2016. So ever since then, there's been that kind of apprehension about those politics. I think that the actual political picture is more complicated than that, and I think that one of the tragedies of the latter half of the Biden administration, to me, is the way that they've surrendered on immigration in particular. I've been saying for years and years and years that if you actually look at polling on immigration collected by Gallup specifically, the fastest rising constituency in American politics up until, I guess, maybe a year or so ago on the issue of immigration was people who thought immigration should be increased. Donald Trump basically craters the number of people who think that immigration should be decreased because his immigration policies are so, we're seeing viscerally, the child separations and the draconian rhetoric on the border that turns people off in a way that actually, for a time, increases the number of Americans who are willing to support expanding immigration policy. And you saw actually, the Biden administration willingness to speak to and act on that. But I think that they, as the election drew near, and given Biden's own vulnerabilities as a candidate, there was a real apprehension about what Trump was going to say on immigration. This stunt of sending migrants to New York City or Chicago and all these major liberal cities from the border had Democratic mayors say, the immigration situation got out of control. So there was a turn that I think, there was a turn where you didn't see Democrats willing to stick up for immigration policy in general. You didn't really see a countervailing message that was actually immigration is good for the economy, it's good for American society, these people commit fewer crimes, these people contribute. You didn't really hear any of that for about 2 years. And you see in the polls now that the number of Americans who think immigration should be decreased has now shot out to a majority in Gallup. This huge spike. I think because the Democrats kind of left that ground uncontested and weren't willing to sort of countervail the message of border crisis and dysfunction. So I think that's the wider story as well. I think that you see Democrats now coming to this idea that the Republicans have won the rhetorical battle on crime and immigration to the point where it's not even worth fighting back. They just tack to the right, keep things simple, and try to ride things out until through the election. I don't know, but I think that the public is more, I don't know, I wouldn't say liberal, but I think that there are ways that you can message around crime and immigration that don't leave, Republicans kind of feeling like they've succeeded here in the way they. But I think that in 2020 you saw this huge spike in people who were willing to say that racism was a problem, that the criminal justice system was unjust towards African Americans, the police shootings were a problem. All the polls showed this huge wave, and there was a bit of a recession backwards, and there was a bit of apprehension about Black Lives Matter as a movement after that. But I don't think that you saw a real deep retreat to where things were, like pre-Ferguson or pre-2014, 15, 16. I think that the American public is a lot more receptive to these issues than they used to be. And that Democrats don't have to be as cautious as they used to be in talking about criminal justice reform. And yet they are. I think there's just been a kind of, I think Democrats aren't willing to believe the public has changed as much as it has on certain issues. I think that's the key. And in the absence of speaking to the way the public has changed, the public has had, for the last 2 years, the only messages that they're hearing about crime and immigration be right-wing Republican messages. And so that missed opportunity to speak to the public in a different way, I think is created this vacuum where there isn't any countervailing messaging. And so people think, oh, maybe Republicans are worried about how out of control crime is, which, as you know, Adam, is not really true. We're not seeing a huge explosion of crime in this country. But you don't hear Democrats trying to make that case. You see them instead basically conceding on that issue and other issues.
And I think it's hard. I think it's because they know that it's hard to argue with people's feelings. I literally watched a news report on one of my local news stations, and this is not one of the sort of really alarmist ones. This is a pretty even-handed news station generally, but it was, residents of this neighborhood are fearful of crime. The LAPD says that crime is down, but they're not buying it. They feel afraid. And the whole piece was them talking to people saying, yes, people are afraid to leave their houses. Then they show that the stats are down in the area, but people are still afraid. And that's the overall tone of the piece is people are afraid and that's a problem. And so I understand if you're an elected politician and someone says, hey, I'm afraid of crime, you can't say, well, actually on a historical basis, crime is at an all-time low. That's not going to stop the person from being afraid. The person's feeling is a material issue you have to deal with. You need some other answer to it. So what is the answer to someone who has a feeling that is a real feeling and yet it is wrong? It's an incorrect feeling.
I mean, that's the challenge of politics. I wouldn't say that I have the answer to how Democrats should run on crime, but I do think that sort of abandoning wholesale the rhetoric of criminal, or not even rhetoric, but like criminal justice reform as policy, is kind of a mistake. I mean, I think that some of the strongest arguments that people made while this was at the center of policy discourse was, look, we have a criminal justice system that punishes people for very, petty offenses in ways that actually contributes to social dysfunction, in ways that takes people out of communities, Black men specifically, and that actually creates more crime in the long run because you sort of dislocated or disrupted the community in ways that you've left families without breadwinners. You've taken people out of the job market and make it difficult for them to come back onto the job market and so on. And so I think there are ways that you can talk about the dysfunction and the injustice of our criminal justice system. They're actually deeply practical and could be presented as answers to in ways that we can reduce and solve crime. People talking about alternatives to policing. I mean, defund the police is not something you can say anymore, but people were, I think, saying, look, there are all kinds of resources that we can give to communities, whether that's mental health resources, opportunities for children after school, and so on, that build the social cohesion of neighborhoods that are struggling and that could reduce crime in the long run, more so in the kind of whack-a-mole approach of, we're going to punish this and that and invest all of our resources in policing alone without structurally changing the conditions that are contributing to crime. I don't think any of that is crazy. I don't think any of that is especially radical. I think people started talking about these kinds of ideas in ways that made it seem like, I don't know. Speaking to, you made this point earlier about the way the left kind of presents its ideas and whether people think strategically or not. I think that there are ways that you could have talked about those ideas that made them seem commonsensical to people, because I think they are commonsensical in many respects. But the point is, like, we're not doing any of that anymore, because I think there's been this fear and apprehension, and we'll see if it lasts, or whether there'll be more willingness to come back to some of that stuff once the election is over and they've actually won it. But I hope so, and I think that only comes from added pressure. I think that people on the left, activists who are really focused on immigration, really focused on criminal justice policy, should continue pushing Harris and the administration, if they win, to come back to these issues.
I guess my worry is that, I've thought about homelessness and crime a lot, and especially my work in local politics here in LA, and my sort of amateur volunteer work, but it's something I think about. And I've had plenty of conversations with people where I tell them, hey, the solution to homelessness isn't to, sweep people off of one corner onto another corner, then they're just still going to be there. You need to provide them with permanent housing. That's what actually gets them off the streets.
Right.
And what I finally realized is there is a large number of people, I don't know if it's a majority, but it's a large number of people who actually do not care about the problem being solved. What they want is they have a lust for vengeance in the human heart. They see people who they do not like, and they want to see the cops come kick their asses and move them from one corner to another. And and that work actually does something functional for them. It actually makes them feel good, in the same way that, giving a long sentence to lock up the crooks and throw away the key, it feels good to have that kind of approach taken, whether or not it works for people. And so to that sort of person, I think sometimes you can't say, hey, guess what? We all want to solve homelessness. Well, actually, maybe we all don't. Like, humans just want punishment and vengeance to some degree. And I guess my worry is, are we, on some of these issues, are we seeing the Democrats give into that impulse? If you look at Gavin Newsom, who's a Democratic star in California, encouraging, or in fact saying he's going to withhold funds from individual cities if they do not start sweeping homeless encampments, which he knows as well as anybody is not going to get anyone off the street, because he knows that there aren't even enough temporary shelter beds for these people, that all that's going to happen is you'll throw their tents in the trash and then tomorrow night they'll be on a different street corner. And I see that and say he's giving in to this reactionary lust for punishment and vengeance. And I don't know, it doesn't seem like a problem of messaging. It seems like a problem of who you are trying to appeal to.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the kind of vengeful, let's purge everyone with police from the streets, I don't think that's like a gettable Democratic constituency. I think that there are some people kind of in the middle of the electorate who, they see the homeless people in communities, or they're worried about crime the way that you described, and they earnestly want to solve it as a problem, and they want to see candidates speak to that. And, I think that, I think that there are ways Democrats can speak to those constituencies, without giving into too much reactionary energy. But I think your overall point is correct in that I think that there are, on the other side, millions of people who are only invested in homelessness as a kind of sign of like cultural rot in some way, or cultural decay. Like, these people are homeless because they're immoral. These people are homeless because they're lazy, they're slothful, and the right thing to do is sort of punish them for their sloth and their indolence. Same thing for people who end up behind bars for whatever reason. It's not because that their neighborhoods were dysfunctional, they didn't go to school, or whatever it happens to be. It's because that these people are sort of fundamentally broken in a way that can't be fixed by well-meaning social reformers, and the right thing to do is purge. And I think that impulse is, I think, a huge part of the energy behind Donald Trump. It's always been there in Republican politics and conservative politics. And I don't know that it can be defeated, to be honest with you. I think that I have the same kind of fatalism, about, I wouldn't say that all people are like this, but I think that there are going to be in any society a lot of people who are like this. And I don't know that there's a way to fix them through politics. They change their minds through politics. I think politicians have a very limited capacity to fundamentally shift the way people think about like narrow issues of policy, much less the way they think about matters of the human heart and their whole disposition to the world. I don't know, that's something you can generally do over the course of an election. I don't know. I don't think most voters are that way. I don't think most people are that way. I think that there's probably a majority of people in this country who think about homelessness as a practical problem to be solved. And we should speak to them. I think the challenge here, one of the enduring challenges, and the challenge that I think occupies most of my thinking now, is that we unfortunately don't have a political system that is responsive to what the majority of people in this country want. We have a political system that gives a disproportionate amount of power to the most conservative people in the country, the people who are most likely to think about homelessness as a kind of psychosocial, whatever issue. I don't think there's an easy answer to that problem. But I do think for as long as we deny that that's the reality of our politics, and that's what structures the way people talk about many political issues and cultural issues, we're not going to get to a point where people can talk about homelessness and or immigration or crime in ways that speak to the broad majority of the country. People are always going to have this temptation to talk about them in reactionary ways.
Yeah, that actually really helps me, because those people who have that, as I always call it, the lust for vengeance. I don't know why it's very epic sounding when I think about it. They may not be the majority, but unfortunately they are currently privileged and prioritized by our political system to the extent that politicians end up running to them. I mean, even if you look at, again, I think about local politics a lot, the way that we run meetings tends to be that the people who are the angriest and most reactionary are the ones who monopolize the microphone, right?
Yeah.
And politicians end up responding to them. Then if you look at everything, the Electoral College, the Senate, all of it prioritizes those conservative reactionary voices. I want to return to the point that you made. I thought it was such a good one, that the issues that the Democratic Party has tacked to the center or the right on are the issues of minorities, whereas they've been to the left on economic issues. I want to talk about that in terms of the racial politics of America. I mean, because it actually reminds me of 2008 a little bit. When we talk about, there's been a lot of talk about how Kamala Harris is not running on her identity in the way that Hillary Clinton did. She's more like Obama in that she's not mentioning it that much. It's fine if she's historic, but that's not the thrust of it. It's about unity. It's about joy. It's about, kitchen table issues. It reminds me of all those things. And I think if I look at the Obama years, I say, well, as a result, a lot of very important issues of the racial politics and policy in America were ignored as a result of that. And why do you think that pattern is repeating? Why is it specifically that we're, those are the issues that are being tacked to the right on? Because it sure looks like, all right, once again, we're just ignoring the issues that affect America's racial minorities primarily, and the same mistake that we've made over and over again for decades.
Yeah. We're ignoring the issues. And like I said before, I think we're ignoring the way that the American public has changed. Again, I don't think that I don't think that most Americans are as far left as I am on immigration or crime, whatever, but they are to the left of where they were in 2014, 15, 16 on these issues. And I think that creates an opportunity space that Democrats should be speaking to. But I think that, whether it's because you literally have some of the same people coming in to advise Harris who were there in the Obama administration, the actual composition of the Democratic, political apparatus haven't really changed that much, or whether it's because there's just kind of a feeling on apprehension on Harris's part. I do think we see ourselves falling, or see them falling into the same kinds of patterns. There isn't much creative thinking. There isn't much courage when it comes to trying to find different ways to talk about these issues that speak to the way the electorate without veering too far to the left. There's not really a willingness to figure out how to thread that needle. I think that the other thing you have to talk about too, frankly, is Harris's own identity. Maybe the case that candidates who are not themselves minorities have more of a space to speak liberally on these issues than candidates who are minorities, who always have to be attuned to the fact that just the reality of who they are triggers a certain perception in people's minds about how liberal they are that has to be managed and dealt with. I think that Harrison understands that and perceives that, and has been, to your point, about as reluctant as Obama was to make her identity a central issue of the campaign. There's a very funny moment in that interview that she just did where Dana Bash, I think, talks about this image that was taken at the DNC where there was a young woman who was watching Harris, a woman of color who was watching Harris with these two braids in the back of her head, and it's centered, and she's looking at Harris, and you can see the photographer's idea as well. This person is really inspired as a young person to be Kamala Harris someday when she grows up, this young person of color. She was asked about this photo, and Harris gives this very kind of flat answer, yes, I saw that photograph. It was very affecting. Harris, I don't know, she just wasn't willing to engage the thing that Bash obviously wanted to engage her on, which is, don't you feel like you are now a beacon to young women of color who want to get ahead in American politics or American society? That you just didn't want to engage that at all. Because she knows that there is, unfortunately, real political risk in making that too much of an issue. So it's a combination of things. I think it's a combination of the kind of policy apprehension that we've already spent so much time talking about, but also I think Harris herself as an individual candidate has to be hypersensitive to, is hypersensitive to the way her identity registers to people. I think this is one of the reasons why Biden won the primary in 2020, actually. And Harris didn't do so well in the primary in 2020. I think that a lot of people who were writing at the time had this perception that, well, we're now in a more progressive Democratic Party in certain respects. People are talking differently about race and immigration and so on. And so that means that a candidate like Kamala Harris or Cory Booker is going to speak to where Democrats are much more than Joe Biden would. I mean, Joe Biden's too old. He's handsy with women. He says all of these off-color things. He's had this terrible record on crime and these issues that people care about now. So that means he's not going to be a contender. That is not where even Black voters in the Democratic Party were at the time. I think there is a real caution that prevailed in the Democratic electorate that put him ahead of the candidates who I think spoke more directly to these changes, like Harris did. So, I think
why is that?
I think that people were afraid of losing again. I mean, as you said, Clinton made a real big deal about the fact that she would have been the first female president. It was her turn, and her term meant that American women had progressed to the point in American society where they could look forward to somebody like Hillary Clinton being the president. And that really meant something to her campaign. And the trauma of her losing, I think, convinced a lot of Democrats that they had to pick the safest person possible the next time around. And Joe Biden was definitely that compared to all the other people who ran. And I think that feeling of caution, that sense of caution, hasn't really eroded. I think it's another thing that's influencing the way that Harris is carrying herself. But I think the Democrats in general, as we were discussing before, they don't want to feel like they are overstepping on culture or on social issues. I think that's true of Harris as it is of anybody.
Yeah, I guess I just I question the framing that these are exclusively cultural issues, right? Because when we talk about criminal justice reform or immigration, these are economic issues to the people who these are material issues, right?
Yes.
Certainly, I would be the first, president of such and such an identity, and people with my same identity would look up to me. That is cultural, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I understand. I'm like, it's a little quiet for that now. We don't need to do that quite as much as we used to. Sure, I understand that.
Right.
It's not stylistically the moment. That's one thing. But when entire issues leave the platform, it's another. And I guess again, talking about reading the tea leaves, and I hate to bring up Ezra Klein yet again. But
what's one more time?
What's one more time? Smart guy. He said in his review of Kamala's speech that she was playing for the middle, and she barely mentioned climate change, but she cares about climate change. And those on the left, or progressives, or however you want to call them, people to the left of that speech, were listening to that speech saying, well, that's what she has to do. Almost like she was doing a reverse dog whistle, where by not talking about the issues that they care about, she was trying to win, which is what, everybody wants her to do. And she'll get in there and she'll work on them when she's in there, right?
Yeah.
Climate change, criminal justice reform, whatever it is. Well, how are we to assume that that's going to be the case, right? Where what is truth and what is reality, especially if you're someone on the left saying, well, we've moved her. There's a line that we got in. Oh, but there's all this stuff we don't like, but that's just for the voters. It's a lot of faith to have, isn't it?
It is. It's not something you can just trust will happen. I mean, climate changes are actually a really good example of this. Joe Biden does not enter the 2020 Democratic primary wanting to be a climate warrior. He had this whole, saga where the Sunrise Movement and other climate activists were really hammering his campaign on how little it was willing to do on climate change. Mm-hmm. And then towards the end, as I was saying before, on that and all sorts of issues, you see Biden shift. But that shift only happens because there was pressure, because there was agitation, because there was real people being very annoying about climate change for a long time and trying to push it to the center of the Democratic agenda. That is the way that the IRA happened. I feel like people have been willing to or trying to write activists out of that story. No, the IRA was not the Green New Deal. It was not exactly what the Sunrise Movement or climate progressives wanted, but it was a major climate accomplishment that came about because there would been all of this energy towards putting climate on the top of the Democratic agenda. It could have been Biden could have passed a big healthcare bill. He could have passed an immigration bill. He could have passed this and that. But there had been so much energy and attention on climate that it would have been impossible for him, I think, to leave this term without having done something on the issue, right? So progressivism there, and I think everywhere under Biden, only came about because progressives, engaged in activism. They ran 2 presidential campaigns where they got millions of primary votes. They established themselves as a real constituency in politics, and an oppositional constituency to the Democratic Party as it had been. And all of that pressure, I think, yielded results. It was not a kind of, well, we'll just wait and see and assume Joe Biden's gonna do what we want. It was, both inside the Democratic Party, as I was talking about before, people making the case in policy circles that progressives were right on inequality and all kinds of issues. And then outside, you have this progressive movement with Bernie Sanders and activism on different fronts. Those 2 things coalesce under Biden to produce, I think, the most progressive Democratic presidency since at least Lyndon Johnson. But it was not a kind of, we'll sit back and trust Democrats to do the right thing deal. It was Democrats, or progressives rather, understanding themselves as a constituency that had power and trying to figure out how to use it to pull the next Democratic president in their direction. I think the very same thing has to happen with Harris. So, she'll say what she needs to say to win the election. And I think that people on the left, understand that. But I don't think we should just assume that when she gets in there, absent pressure and absent an attempt to focus her attention on the issues we care about, that she's going to do, she's going to be as progressive as a president as she could be. I think that she'll be porting over a lot of what Biden did onto her agenda. We're seeing it already as she's trying to flesh out her policy agenda, but that's not, that in and of itself isn't going to guarantee anything. I think that the left should continue to make itself heard on all of these issues. And I think that's what politics is about, not just electing somebody and going home, after you cast a vote in November. It's an ongoing process of engagement.
That actually really helps me because, I've also seen, I have plenty of friends on the left who have been doing a lot of negative Kamala posts, it's another warmonger. It's another, she's going to build the most lethal military and criminal justice and everything. And, we can't trust her. And so forget about her. And maybe it is a matter of more, rather than seeing the person you elect as being a single person who's going to represent all of your values, and then you'll set it and forget it. Instead, no, these people are empty vessels who you need to push no matter who the fuck they are.
Exactly.
That's
politics. I mean, that just is politics. Like there's no, that's just how you have to engage. I just, I think that there is space to pull these people in a slightly more leftward direction. I think that Biden's demonstrated that. I think the American history demonstrates that. That doesn't mean that you are, in love with Kamala Harris or whatever, but it means that you understand politics as a system of, gears and pulleys and levers and well-placed people that you can influence. And you can influence to your ends while you continue to build more power. And the more power you build, the more you can influence them. That's how the whole thing works. I don't see an alternative. And that's not to say that people, again, I think that the criticism is good. I think that she should be criticized for continuing to support, I think, a genocidal war in Gaza. I think that should be at the front line of the way we talk about foreign policy. And as the election continues, I think the uncommitted movement did exactly the right thing in Chicago. I think it is disgraceful that they didn't allow a Palestinian speaker on stage for the entirety of the convention, and they were right to mount a protest about that. I just think that, politics is about trying to do things and not sitting at home, posting that nothing can be done. That that's I don't understand. Like it's
yes.
Even if things are ultimately futile, you want to have at least tried every way you possibly could to pull things in the right direction.
Yes.
We don't have the luxury of not trying. And electoral politics is one lever. It's not the lever that everybody has to take to invest themselves in, As you said, there are all kinds of ways to organize and build power for the left, whether that's labor organizing, tenant organizing your community, immigrants' rights, immigrant aid. There are all kinds of things that can be done. If you don't want to engage in the monkey world of democratic politics, you don't have to. There are other things you can do. But this is, for better or for worse, one of the primary ways that we can achieve material change for people in this country. And we don't do it by being buddy-buddy with them and saying that they are the coconut. It's important that the coconut thing was semi-ironic. Like, it's important that there was a real distance there, right? There needs to be distance from these people who are doing bad things and who are not leftists. But it's distance, I think, that ought to be crafted because we want to see that what they have to offer clearly, want to see who they are clearly, and seeing those things clearly allows us to strategize about the ways that they can be used to the ends that we desire as a movement. And so, I think that's how I felt about Harris. That's how I feel about the Democratic Party as a whole. And I think more and more people on the left are coming to think that. We'd be remiss, actually, if we didn't talk a little bit about the Bernie and AOC thing.
Sure, let's talk about it.
Right, towards the end, in the final days of Biden's time as a candidate, both of them kind of made this calculation that, he wasn't going to go. And so it was worth kind of jumping on board with him. Or if he did go, they wanted to be seen, I think, as good sports and team players in the Democratic Party, that they weren't going to be seen serving him. Now, I think that they should have, at that point, it would have been safe for them to say, Biden should step aside. I think that was a miscalculation.
Yeah, I mean, Chuck Schumer was saying it. They could have said it too.
Exactly. But I think that the fact that they made a strategic choice there, I think it was the wrong one. But the fact that they thought to themselves, okay, we need to figure out what the best way to position ourselves within the Democratic Party is right now in this moment, is indicative, I think, of a seriousness. They're asking the right questions about what they should do. Right. They're not, swearing off engagement with these politicians. They're not swearing off presidential politics and sort of saying it's all baloney and ideally you should just elect Bernie Sanders again. They saw the political situation and tried to think through, what would be the best for the left as far as its place in the Democratic coalition would be. I think that they made the wrong choice, but they were asking the right question. And I think that's reflective of, I think, where most people on the left are. We have these debates about what strategically might be the best thing to do in a moment. But we're all doing so with the knowledge, I think most of us are doing so with the knowledge that this party and its coalition are kind of what we have to work with, at least as far as electoral politics is concerned, which again, you don't have to do, you don't have to engage in. If it disgusts you, it disgusts me, more and more. And, if there's nothing you want to engage in, you don't have to. But this is a lever. This is a way of implementing change. And if you want to utilize it, you have to think clearly about the players involved. And, I think that there are more people on the left who are willing to do that now than I think there were a couple of years ago.
That is an incredible place to leave it. That this has been a wonderful conversation. You've helped me see a lot of things a lot more clearly. Thank you so much for being here, Osita. Where can people find your work on the internet?
You can find me at ositanawanevu.com. You can also find, I think, most of my work at this point at The New Republic and The Guardian, and very soon a book will be out next year. Not too soon, but getting sooner every day on American democracy called The Right of the People. You can look for that, I think, spring or summer of next year.
Amazing. Thank you so much for being here, Osita. It's been an incredible conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I hope you loved that conversation as much as I did. If you want to support the show, head to factuallypod.com/Adam Conover. $5 a month gets you every episode ad-free. For $15 a month, I will read your name in the credits of this podcast and put it in the credits of every single one of my video monologues. This week, I want to thank Stephen Volcano, Angeline Montoya, Codename Italian, Matthew Reimer, Ethan, and Barack Peled. Head to patreon.com/Adam Conover if you would like to join them. Once again, coming up soon, I'm headed to Baltimore, Portland, Oregon, Seattle, Denver, Austin, Batavia, Illinois, Chicago, San Francisco, Toronto, Boston, and Providence, Rhode Island. I would love to see you out there on the road. Head to adamconover.net for all my tickets and tour dates. As always, I want to thank my producers, Sam Rodman and Tony Wilson, everybody here at HeadGum for making the show possible. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you next time on Factually.
That was a HeadGum podcast.